Hi, I'm Ashley from Sunny Maid, and today we are going to talk borders. Welcome back. We are on month 9, week 2 of our beginner skill builder sampler quilt. If you're here for that, I'm glad you're here. If you're here just to learn about borders, I'm glad you're here as well. Last week we worked on our quilt. This is our current state of our quilt. We put on the sashing and I'll put all our blocks together. So now it's time to do the final step of our quilt top, which is putting on borders. Borders are a little funny because I have done things the right way, I have done things the wrong way, and some of them have turned out better than others. So I'm going to tell you what I know, what I've learned, and what also I've learned about borders and how to put them on. Okay, first of all, you can have too big of borders and too small of borders. What I mean is too long on one side, and you can also have too short. So if you take your quilt and you're sewing on a border, okay, if it's shorter than the side of the quilt, the inner part of your quilt is going to get kind of bunchy and wrinkly. And the outer part, the border itself, will be fairly straight. Now, if your border is longer than the size of your quilt, but you finagle it enough so that it goes right down the side of your quilt like you're supposed to, what you're going to end up is a wrinkly border. Okay, so how do we avoid this? A lot of quilt patterns will tell you this is how big our quilt is. This is how big to cut your borders. For instance, our quilt right now should be, our blocks are 12.5 inches. Our sashing is 2.5 inches. With the seam allowance, we should be at 40.5 inches from corner to corner. So the quilt pattern will say you need 2 strips that are 40.5 inches. You'll sew the top and the bottom. And then once those are on, you'll need the side borders, which then you'll add the 2 inches top and bottom. You'll need 2 pieces that are 44.5 inches by 44.5 inches. That is probably what we're going to do. However, in a perfect world, our quilts come out perfect. Most quilts are not perfect. So this is what you want to do. You want to first measure the edge of your quilt, okay, corner to corner. Then you want to measure the middle of your quilt. So if I fold my quilt here in half, you're going to measure from one edge to the other edge, and figure out where it lies. Why do we want to do this? In the center of our quilt is probably going to be smaller because you're going to have more seams, and we get off just a little bit on each seam. It's going to be smaller. Towards the outer edge of our quilt, there's going to be less seams and more pieces. Okay, do you see how it is here like that? Okay, so one way to decide how long to make your border is you take both of those measurements and find an average. And how you do that is you add them both together and divide in half. So that is a good start. which means it's probably going to be slightly smaller than the outside edge. And that is okay, and I'll tell you that in a minute. The other thing you could do is just measure the outer edge and take away 1/2 inch. So it's technically smaller, but you stretch the fabric as you sew it on, you finagle it on so that it comes out to the same length. Now let me tell you why we want to do that. Remember how I said if it's too long, it gets wrinkly along the border. So if we take it and it's slightly smaller than the edge of our quilt, as we finagle it on there, we're not going to end up with a wrinkly border. It also means we're not going to end up with a wrinkly middle. And the way that I did that, actually, I created this big long piece of border, and then I just stretched it as I sewed it on, and I didn't do any measurements. And I ended up stretching it enough that when I took it off my sewing machine, it went like this, and then the middle of my quilt was all wrinkly. And then at that point, you have to decide, what do you want to do about that? Honestly, it didn't make much difference because once we quilted it, we did the sandwich and put it on the long arm, the quilt sandwich, and we put it on the long arm. Once I quilted it and washed it, it didn't make any difference. But it does make a difference when your border is wrinkly, because then you end up, and I'll talk to you about a long arm next week. We're going to talk about ways to quilt it. But as I put mine on my long arm that ended up with a wrinkly border, and I'm trying to stretch the quilt top and the bottom so it lays all nice so I can quilt it, then I ended up with not a square quilt. And then you end up, as you quilt it, you end up with tucks and stuff along the edge because your border, there's too much border. Okay, I hope that helps. So what are we going to do? Ideally, we are just going to measure and sew on. And the reason why I'm saying that is because you and I are only going to put 2.5 inches around the edge of the quilt. It's only enough to break it up, pull it off the edge of the quilt, and just make it look a little nicer. When you get the wider off the middle of the quilt, that is when you want to start measuring and possibly making it slightly smaller than the edge of your quilt, because you get a 4-inch border on your quilt and you may end up with a lot of wrinkle. Okay, so what do we want to do? I pulled out my white fabric. I buy it by the yards, and I was trying to decide how exactly I want to do this. I went ahead and cut 5 width of fabric strips. Okay, so 5 of them that are 2.5 inches wide, and then I cut off the salvage edge. One of these strips should be good enough to go down the top and the bottom, and then you'll probably need, that's why we had a 5th one, you'll probably need to sew pieces together to create it long enough to go down the side, because we need it 44.5 inches, and most fabric with salvage is 43 to 44 inches. So you are going to need it to be a little bit longer than a width of fabric. Okay, so it is very important though that you measure, because I don't want your quilt to be, let's say you didn't quite do a 1/4 inch seam allowance, you did a little more, and you ended up with a 39.5 inch edge instead of a 40.5 inch edge. You don't want to be trying to put on a 40.5 inch border onto your edge when it's only 39.5 inches. So please, please, please make sure you iron it. Okay, so I have my strips of fabric. There's 5 of those. And the next thing you want to think about is, how do we want to sew them on? I generally sew on the left and right first, and then the top and bottom second. The good news is about this quilt, there's really not a top and the bottom. And the reason why I like to do the top and the bottom second is I just like that nice crisp line across the top of my quilt. So this is a square. There's not a top and a bottom. I mean, I guess technically I did put it together. This is technically the top of my quilt. And this is the center of my quilt, and that is the bottom of my quilt. So I'm going to start by putting a strip on each side of my quilt. Now you want to make sure that your iron is nicely hot. I had to get mine going because I hadn't turned it on yet. And make sure you have some pins, because we're going to pin this puppy on. It will make it look a lot nicer and a lot more even along the side. Okay, so first I'm going to get out my measuring tape, and I'm going to measure the edge of my quilt. Just going to make sure that I did indeed make it 40.5 inches. Yep, almost right on the dot. I'm pretty proud of myself for that one. Okay, so now I have 2 strips of fabric that are both 40.5 inches by 2.5 inches. Get my pins. Okay, I'm going to start by folding it in half, figuring out where the center of my strip is. Place a pin on it so don't lose it. Then I'm going to fold my, ow, then I just poked myself in the hand. I'm going to fold my quilt in half so I can find the center of my quilt as well. Put a pin right in that fold. Then I'm going to line up these 2 pins and start by pinning the middle of my strip of fabric right where that pin was on the edge of my quilt. I can then, if I want to put in more pins, I can. I'm going to just stretch it down so that it lines up with the edge down here, and line it up with my top edge up here. Okay, I'm going to then pin on my other border on the opposite side, take it to my sewing machine, 1/4 inch seam, all the way down one side and all the way down the other. Okay, a few tips for while we are sewing. First of all, you want to make sure that you keep the rest of your quilt out of your sewing machine. So if you need to, take lots of stops, pause it, make sure that you the rest of that quilt just stays away from the needle. Make sure this is nice and flat. Second, as you're sewing, make sure that your seams are all laying down flat in the direction that we originally ironed them. So the sashing should all go towards the middle of the sashing. And the star blocks, just pay attention to how the star blocks are laid. The other thing I would suggest, which I don't normally suggest on a regular quilt block, I would suggest back stitching at the top and the bottom of this. And this will help your border stay in place and not have a cause to get unstitched or skewed as we go to sew on the next side of the border. Okay, so as we iron this, we're going to do the same thing we did with the sashing. We're going to put the border side up, iron it to set that seam, finger press it open, and then come back and hit it again with your iron to make sure it stays nice in place. Okay, now that we have the two sides on, we are going to measure the top and the bottom. Ideally, it should be 44.5 inches from one side to the other. Try not to burn my fingers. Yep, just exactly that. So I have prepared 2 strips of fabric that are 44.5 inches. Now you have a couple options here. When I go to sew my border fabric, if I have enough, I like to sew them on the diagonal. So it's a diagonal seam instead of a straight across seam, and that just helps it not get too bunchy. So I have my 44.5 inch strip. Same thing again, I'm going to fold it in half. Grab a pin, mark it. And I'm going to fold this one in half. Okay, then make sure if you have to piece it, that you get your seams going in the right direction so you don't have to take them off later. Right sides together. Pull out one of those pins after you line them up. Pin it into place. And then I'm going to pin each end. One on that end and one on this end. I'm going to get my second border in place, pinned onto the other side, and then I'm going to take it to the sewing machine, do that 1/4 inch seam allowance, make sure that I keep the rest of my quilt out of the way, and get that border sewn on. Okay, got my last borders on. Now I gotta get it ironed. And then we will have a finished quilt top. Once again, make sure as you put these on that you go around and trim any of the strings that might still be on your quilt, and make sure they're not coming up through the seams. And then you will be ready to get your quilt all prepped for quilting, which is what we're going to go over next week. I'm going to give you a few ideas of how you can do quilting yourself. Do it yourself or have someone else do it. And there you go. Don't you like how it has that border, pulls it away from the edge? It'll give us room to put on a beautiful binding, and it's all done. We're ready to go. That is so exciting. If you have any questions, please make sure you leave them down in the comments section below, and I will get back to you and answer those. Now for show and tell time. What have I been working on this week? I told you last week I was working on some cute little aprons. Look how adorable those are. She is turning 5 on Thursday, so she is super excited. This is her chef's hat. It was supposed to have Velcro here. I didn't have any Velcro. I was trying to get it done, so I used, of course, pink ribbon. And what this allows us to do is tie it so it fits her head. And if she has a growing head or pigtails or something, it'll still go on. I got my quilt top all put together, and I have a really fun block of the month I'm currently working on. It's coming out of my favorite local quilt shop. They are doing a mystery quilt with fabric line Sleuth from Juicy Juice. And she has designed a quilt. And then we have another lady that put together a story to go with the quilt blocks. So every month we get our pattern for that quilt block and we get a piece of the story. So it's kind of fun. This was August's release. And so mainly it was a house, which is fun, and a couple of pieces. Idaho. I'm in Idaho. Flying geese, pinwheel, and of course the sawtooth star. So I'm excited. It's almost time for this month's piece. So I'm excited for it to come. I want to see what you're doing. Make sure you tag me at Ashley_SunnyMade on Instagram. I want to see what you're doing. I want to see how your quilt's coming along. I would love to see your fun work. Okay, have a great week. We'll see you next week, and happy sewing.